The day my family started asking about my blood pressure was the day I realized something had changed. Not in my health, in them. I am Helen Parker, 70 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, my children rarely called unless there was a birthday, a holiday, or a problem that needed solving. Then I updated my will. Suddenly, I was the most interesting person in the family. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring. The sky over New York was clear, and sunlight spilled across my kitchen table where a stack of legal papers rested beside a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I had spent the previous afternoon meeting with my attorney, making a few practical changes to my estate documents. Nothing dramatic, nothing secret. At my age, organizing these things simply felt responsible. Life has a way of reminding you that time matters. My husband, Richard, had passed away 8 years earlier, and since then I had handled everything myself. The house, the savings, the investments, the decisions. I signed the final page, thanked my attorney, and drove home feeling relieved. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning. The first call came the next morning from my daughter Sarah. She sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom, how are you feeling today?" she asked. I smiled. "I feel fine." "Any dizziness lately?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Sarah had never asked me that before. I laughed and told her I was perfectly healthy. She seemed disappointed by the answer. 2 days later, my son Daniel called. Daniel was a good man, but busy, very busy. Most months I was lucky to get one conversation. Yet suddenly he wanted to know if I was eating enough vegetables and getting enough sleep. He even asked when my last physical examination had been. After we hung up, I sat in my living room staring at the phone. The silence felt different somehow, like a puzzle piece had been placed on the table, but I could not yet see the picture. By the weekend, the attention became impossible to ignore. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, appeared at my front door carrying homemade soup. Melissa had never brought me soup before. She hugged me warmly and spent 20 minutes telling me how important family was. Then she casually asked whether I had everything organized for the future. The question floated between us like a balloon neither of us wanted to touch. I noticed it. She noticed that I noticed it. Neither of us said anything more. That night, I sat alone in my den and looked through old family photographs. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, smiling faces frozen in time. I thought about how relationships change, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The following Monday, my phone buzzed again. Sarah had sent me an article about healthy aging. Daniel texted reminders about annual checkups. Melissa asked whether I needed help managing my finances. 3 weeks earlier, none of them seemed concerned about my daily routine. Now they were treating me like a priceless antique that needed constant monitoring. I walked to the window and looked out across my backyard. The trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Everything appeared peaceful, yet a quiet voice in the back of my mind kept repeating the same question. What exactly had they heard after I updated my will? By the middle of the week, the subtle shifts in behavior became impossible to ignore. Every call from Daniel or Sarah carried the same careful concern, questions that sounded ordinary but were laced with curiosity about my routines, my diet, my sleep, and even my energy levels throughout the day. Melissa, meanwhile, seemed to appear more frequently at my home under the guise of dropping off groceries or inviting me to family dinners. I noticed the extra attentiveness, the way she lingered in conversation, asked follow-up questions, and complimented my cooking with unusual enthusiasm. One afternoon, while rearranging a stack of magazines in the living room, I observed her sliding her hand across the counter with a casual glance at the filing cabinet where my important documents were stored. I could feel her eyes on me and on the room, as if measuring my movement, as if calculating something I was only beginning to understand. I began keeping subtle notes in my journal about the timing of their calls, the tone of their voices, and the questions they asked. Patterns emerged quickly. Discussions about wills, retirement funds, and insurance policies cropped up more frequently than before. I did not confront anyone, though I felt the urge. Instead, I watched, quietly observing the ways they interacted, the expressions flickering across their faces when topics of inheritance were mentioned. During one evening dinner, Daniel asked, almost casually, if I had scheduled my next checkup and whether I might need someone to accompany me. His words were polite, but I could see a tension under the surface, a curiosity that felt too pointed to be merely familial concern. Sarah commented on my energy level, mentioning she had read an article about staying active past 70 and recommended I try a new fitness routine, smiling as if suggesting it out of kindness. But again, the timing fell off. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, reviewing the notes I had made in my journal. The realization settled in slowly. My family's sudden interest in my health was not coincidental. It coincided with the update to my will. The patterns were too consistent, the attention too focused. The affection that had appeared overnight was not born from renewed love or concern, but from opportunity and curiosity about the changes in my estate. I took a deep breath and allowed myself to feel the mixture of emotions stirring inside: disappointment, surprise, and an odd sense of amusement at their audacity. Despite the growing tension, I maintained composure, knowing that observation and patience were now my greatest allies. I moved through the living room, straightening cushions and adjusting the placement of family photos, allowing my mind to map out a strategy. If they thought their sudden attentiveness would manipulate me or catch me unaware, they were mistaken. Each question, each visit, each exaggerated compliment had become a clue, a breadcrumb leading me to a clearer understanding of their intentions. By the time evening fell, I had a plan forming in my mind, not for confrontation, but for controlled action, observation, and quietly regaining the upper hand while they remained unaware that I already knew their true focus and motives. By the end of the week, Helen Parker had begun to notice every detail, every glance, and every carefully worded question. Her children's visits had become more frequent, and Melissa lingered in her home longer than ever before, offering help that felt unusually attentive. Helen observed the subtle body language, the way Melissa's hand would brush near the paperwork on the counter, the way Daniel and Sarah's eyes would flick toward the shelves holding her financial documents. It was as if a curtain had been lifted, revealing motives hidden beneath the surface of everyday politeness. Helen began keeping a meticulous record in her journal, noting dates, questions, and actions, each entry a map of behavioral patterns that spoke louder than words. During a midweek family dinner, Daniel commented on her energy and suggested she might need assistance with grocery shopping or household tasks, phrasing it as concern but carrying an undertone of curiosity about her daily routine. Sarah chimed in, mentioning articles on senior health and hinting at checkups, almost as though they were timing their advice with the presumed updates to her estate. Helen's awareness sharpened. She realized this attention was not born of newfound affection, but rather a careful interest in her decisions, her plans, and her possessions. The realization was unsettling, but also clarifying. Helen responded to each comment and offer with calm politeness, never revealing the depth of her understanding, while internally cataloging every interaction. One quiet afternoon, she rearranged her living room, straightening cushions and adjusting photographs, letting her movements appear ordinary while her mind assessed the intentions behind each glance, each question. She recalled the days when concern from her family had been sporadic and practical, and contrasted it with the current intensity, realizing how orchestrated their attention had become. By evening, Helen had developed a mental strategy, noting that observation and patience were more powerful than immediate confrontation. She brewed a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window, and watched the light shift across her garden, reflecting on the slow accumulation of signs that had brought clarity. She understood that her family's sudden vigilance was an opportunity to quietly regain agency, to monitor actions without yielding to manipulation. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, Helen's journal lay open, full of notes and patterns, serving as a map of intentions and reactions. The house remained quiet, the city distant beyond the windows, yet the tension of unfolding motives created an invisible energy in the rooms around her. She moved deliberately through her home, each step measured, her mind working through scenarios and responses. The attentiveness of Daniel, Sarah, and Melissa had unintentionally revealed the structure of their concern, and Helen now recognized that by maintaining calm composure, documenting carefully, and observing patiently, she could navigate the situation with clarity and strategy. The realization brought a steady confidence. The family's sudden interest in her health was no longer disconcerting, but a tool for Helen to quietly assess, anticipate, and plan the steps she would take in the days ahead. ensuring that her decisions and intentions remained fully under her control. The following Sunday, I invited the family to lunch. It was something I had done dozens of times over the years, long before anyone seemed interested in my cholesterol levels or whether I remembered to take my vitamins. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. The oak table Richard and I bought during our first year of marriage sat beneath the same chandelier. The framed family photographs remained lined across the sideboard, yet something felt different. Perhaps it was because I was seeing everyone more clearly now. Daniel arrived first, carrying a bottle of sparkling water and asking whether I had been sleeping well. Sarah followed 10 minutes later with a basket of fresh fruit and an article she had printed about healthy eating after 70. Melissa arrived last, smiling warmly as she handed me a bouquet of flowers and immediately asked whether I had considered hiring someone to help manage household responsibilities. 3 weeks ago, none of these conversations would have happened. I noticed every detail, every carefully chosen word, every glance exchanged across the table. During lunch, I listened far more than I spoke. Daniel talked about work. Sarah discussed a neighbor who had recently moved into assisted living. Melissa shared a story about an elderly relative who had struggled to keep up with home maintenance. The examples seemed random at first. Then I realized they all pointed toward the same subject: aging, dependence, future planning. I cut a piece of chicken and placed it carefully on my plate. "I appreciate everyone's concern," I said gently. 3 sets of eyes immediately focused on me. It is nice to know my health has become such an important topic lately. A brief silence followed. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. Daniel looked down at his drink. Sarah adjusted her napkin. Melissa smiled a little too quickly. "We just care about you," Sarah said. "Of course," I replied. It is funny how timing works. The room grew quieter. I could almost hear the clock ticking in the hallway. No one asked what I meant. No one wanted to open that door. After lunch, while everyone moved into the living room for coffee, I remained behind to clear a few dishes. Through the doorway, I watched them talking softly among themselves. Their voices were too low to hear clearly, but their body language spoke volumes. Heads leaned together. Eyes occasionally drifted toward me. A conversation paused whenever I entered the room. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Later that afternoon, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in Richard's old armchair. The house felt peaceful again. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating dust particles that drifted lazily through the air. My gaze settled on a photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. Richard stood beside me with one arm around my shoulder. Daniel and Sarah were younger then. Life seemed simpler. Back then, family gatherings were about spending time together. Nobody cared about legal documents or future inheritances. Nobody measured affection against potential financial outcomes. I picked up my journal and reviewed the notes I had collected over the past month. A pattern had become impossible to ignore. The increased visits had started only days after my attorney appointment. The questions had grown more specific each week. Their concern appeared sincere on the surface, yet it consistently circled back to my age, my health, my finances, or my long-term plans. As evening settled across the neighborhood, I closed the journal and stared out the window. Somewhere along the way, my family had become interested in something far more valuable than my well-being. The question was no longer whether they were hiding their motives. The question was how much they already believed they knew about my plans. By midweek, Helen Parker had begun to treat every interaction with her family as a test of intent. The subtle changes in their behavior, which had seemed innocuous at first, now revealed an unmistakable pattern. Daniel's phone calls arrived at precise times of day, often mentioning his concern for her blood pressure, diet, and energy levels, questions that felt increasingly pointed. Sarah had taken to dropping by unannounced under the guise of casual visits, carrying health magazines or small gifts intended to prompt conversation about her routines. Melissa's attentiveness escalated in quiet ways, offering to organize her kitchen, adjusting decorative items while casting a glance toward her important files, lingering in hallways just long enough to appear casual but to observe carefully. Helen noticed every detail, the timing, the phrasing, the eye contact, and began cataloging them meticulously in her journal. Each note was a thread, weaving together an image of calculated curiosity that she had not seen before. One afternoon, as she sorted a stack of financial documents, she realized they had begun to mirror the questions of her attorney, subtly probing what she had recently formalized in her will. She sipped chamomile tea slowly, letting the warmth of the cup center her thoughts, acknowledging the growing tension but maintaining an exterior of calm composure. During another visit, Daniel asked whether she needed assistance setting up appointments or managing paperwork, presenting it as casual concern while his body language betrayed heightened interest. Sarah suggested new fitness routines, commenting on longevity and independence, emphasizing her mother's health with an intensity that seemed disproportionate. Helen responded politely, affirming her well-being while noting every inflection, every subtle hesitation, and every glance toward her home office and filing cabinet. By evening, after the family had departed, she reviewed the day's observations, cross-referencing notes with previous interactions. Patterns emerged clearly. Their sudden attentiveness was directly linked to her will update, and the increased concern over health was a veneer for curiosity about her estate and assets. She considered how much they believed they understood, how far they might push, and how she could maintain control without confrontation. As she moved through her home, straightening cushions, adjusting photographs, and ensuring each object appeared in its usual place, Helen recognized the quiet power in observation, patience, and careful documentation. The knowledge of their intentions gave her a subtle but undeniable advantage. She felt a steady resolve form within her. By cataloging behaviors, anticipating questions, and understanding the timing of each interaction, she realized she was no longer merely reacting but guiding the dynamic without them even noticing. The house was peaceful, sunlight fading through the windows, yet Helen felt fully alert, fully aware, and fully in control, ready to navigate the increasingly calculated attentiveness of Daniel, Sarah, and Melissa in the days to come while ensuring her decisions and actions remained completely under her authority. The following week, I decided to make a small change. It was not dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but it was significant enough for me. I scheduled another meeting with my attorney. I did not tell Daniel. I did not tell Sarah. I certainly did not tell Melissa. The appointment was set for a Thursday morning, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely curious about what would happen next. Sometimes the best way to understand people is to remove the information they think they have and watch how they react. On the morning of the meeting, I drove into the city under a gray sky. Traffic moved slowly, giving me plenty of time to think. During the appointment, my attorney reviewed several documents and asked whether I was comfortable with the current arrangements. I smiled and told him I was considering a few changes. Not because I felt pressured, not because I was angry, simply because recent events had given me a clearer understanding of the people who might one day benefit from those decisions. He nodded knowingly. When I returned home that afternoon, there was a voicemail waiting from Sarah. She wanted to know how I was feeling. An hour later, Daniel called and asked whether I had been keeping up with my medical appointments. By evening, Melissa sent a message reminding me that she would be happy to help organize paperwork if I ever felt overwhelmed. I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone and almost laughed. Their timing had become remarkably predictable. Over the next several days, I noticed something even more interesting. Their concerns seemed to increase whenever they believed something important might be happening in my life. If I mentioned meeting with a financial advisor, someone called within 24 hours. If I mentioned reviewing household expenses, another family member suddenly wanted to visit. It was as though invisible alarm bells were ringing somewhere beyond my view. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. We sat on the back patio while spring sunlight warmed the garden. He talked about work for a few minutes before gradually steering the conversation toward future planning. "Have you thought about simplifying things?" he asked. "What things?" I replied. "The house, the finances, responsibilities." I took a sip of iced tea before answering. "I managed them just fine." He nodded quickly, too quickly. Then he changed the subject. Later that evening, I wrote several pages in my journal. For weeks, I had focused on identifying patterns. Now I was beginning to understand motivations. There is a difference. Patterns show what people do. Motivations reveal why they do it. The realization was strangely calming. I no longer felt disappointed every time someone asked another carefully disguised question. I no longer felt surprised when Melissa appeared with a casserole or when Sarah forwarded another article about healthy aging. Their actions were becoming easier to read, easier to predict, easier to understand. As the days passed, something else changed as well. The more I observed, the less power their behavior seemed to have over me. I stopped wondering whether they genuinely cared. Instead, I focused on what their actions revealed. The answers were far more valuable than their words. One evening, as I closed my journal and prepared for bed, a thought crossed my mind that refused to leave. If my family was suddenly paying this much attention to my future, perhaps it was time for me to learn exactly what future they believed was waiting for them. By the following Monday, Helen Parker had fully shifted her approach to handling her family's sudden attentiveness. She moved through her home with deliberate calm, observing each detail and interaction without revealing the depth of her understanding. The morning sunlight streamed softly through the windows, illuminating the wooden floors and highlighting family photographs that had witnessed decades of birthdays, graduations, and everyday life. Daniel arrived first, carrying a folder he claimed contained articles on health, speaking with an eagerness that had not existed weeks before. Helen listened carefully, nodding politely, and noticed the way his gaze flicked toward her filing cabinet as he asked seemingly casual questions. Sarah followed shortly, offering to help organize recipes and household tasks, her tone gentle but her eyes scanning the room for more information than was necessary. Melissa appeared last, carrying a small gift and suggesting a new supplement she thought might improve Helen's energy, pausing slightly to observe the reaction. Helen absorbed every detail, cataloging the subtleties in her mind. Each glance, each question, each carefully timed gesture revealed the unspoken concern regarding her updated will, and she noted how quickly their focus returned to matters of inheritance even while discussing her health. She poured a cup of tea and moved to her den, setting the cup down and opening her journal to review all observations collected over the past 2 weeks. Patterns emerged vividly. Their curiosity intensified in proportion to the relevance of any changes she had made to her estate or her daily habits. Helen reflected on the juxtaposition of appearance versus intention, realizing how polite manners and feigned concern could conceal motives of subtle manipulation. She planned her next steps with precision, deciding to continue engaging only superficially while maintaining control over the environment and timing of information revealed. Over the next several days, Helen observed as Daniel tried to steer conversations toward financial topics. Sarah suggested adjustments to her routine with an underlying subtext, and Melissa offered help that seemed increasingly performative, each action providing a glimpse into their true priorities. She adjusted furniture and photographs subtly, ensuring everything appeared normal while confirming her control over the household. Helen recognized that her quiet patience and deliberate observation allowed her to maintain the upper hand without confrontation. By the end of the week, she had mapped out who was most eager for details, which topics triggered the strongest responses, and how each family member measured her reactions. As evening descended, Helen sat by the window, the sky outside shifting to shades of amber and gold. Her home was calm, orderly, and yet charged with the invisible tension of calculated curiosity. She understood clearly now that knowledge and patience were more powerful than confrontation. The family's attention, however intense, was no longer disconcerting but a tool for her to anticipate, prepare, and subtly guide the unfolding dynamics. Helen closed her journal and allowed herself a small, quiet smile, confident that the next moves would be hers to make, measured and deliberate, as the undercurrents of curiosity continued to ripple through the house. A few days later, I decided it was time to stop observing from a distance and start learning how much my family truly believed they knew. The opportunity arrived. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Daniel had invited me to dinner at his house, something that would have seemed ordinary under normal circumstances. Recently, however, nothing felt ordinary. The rain tapped softly against my windshield as I drove across town. By the time I arrived, the clouds had turned the evening sky a dull gray. Melissa greeted me warmly at the door. Too warmly. She took my coat before I could hang it myself and insisted I sit down while she prepared coffee. Daniel appeared from the kitchen with the same attentive smile I had seen repeatedly over the past month. Sarah arrived shortly afterward. As we gathered around the dining table, I noticed the familiar pattern immediately. The conversation began with harmless topics: work, weather, neighborhood news. Then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, it drifted toward the future. Sarah mentioned retirement planning. Melissa talked about an elderly neighbor who had recently sold her home. Daniel brought up estate taxes after reading an article online. Each topic seemed unrelated on its own. Together, they formed a roadmap. I listened quietly while stirring my coffee. Then I decided to test something. I spent part of yesterday reviewing some financial documents, I said casually. The reaction was immediate. Daniel looked up first. Sarah paused mid-sentence. Melissa stopped reaching for her cup. The silence lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. It told me everything. Just routine paperwork, I added. 3 smiles appeared almost simultaneously. The conversation resumed. Yet from that moment forward, I noticed an unmistakable shift. Questions became more frequent, more specific, more careful. Daniel wanted to know whether managing finances ever felt stressful. Sarah asked whether I had considered simplifying certain responsibilities. Melissa wondered whether I had updated important records recently. I answered politely without revealing anything useful. By the end of dinner, I felt strangely calm. For weeks, I had been trying to understand whether my suspicions were justified. Now I no longer doubted myself. Their curiosity was not about me. It was about access. Access to information. Access to decisions. Access to a future they were already imagining. That realization followed me home that night. As rain continued falling outside, I sat in my den and opened my journal. I reviewed every note I had taken since this began. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. What surprised me most was not their interest in money or inheritance. Human nature has always included those temptations. What surprised me was how quickly genuine connections seemed to disappear whenever financial possibilities entered the picture. I thought about Richard. If he had been sitting beside me, he would have recognized the signs immediately. He always understood people better than I did. I smiled softly at the memory before returning my attention to the pages in front of me. Then I made a decision. For the next few days, I would reveal nothing. No updates. No hints. No discussions about legal matters. I wanted to see what happened when the flow of information stopped completely. Sometimes silence reveals more than conversation ever could. As I closed the journal and looked out at the rain-covered streetlights beyond the window, I felt something I had not experienced since this entire situation began. Certainty. Not about what my family would do next, but about what I would do. Because the more carefully I listened, the clearer their priorities became. And the clearer their priorities became, the more important it was that my next move belonged entirely to me. The weekend arrived with an unexpected clarity. I, Helen Parker, decided it was time to address the culmination of weeks of observation, subtle manipulations, and careful attention from my family. The sun shone through my living room windows, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floors. Daniel, Sarah, and Melissa arrived in staggered intervals, each carrying the same courteous smiles, but betraying an undercurrent of curiosity I had come to anticipate. I greeted them warmly, maintaining the calm, composed exterior I had cultivated over the past month, letting them believe they still held the advantage. We gathered around the dining table, where the familiar oak surface bore the marks of countless family dinners and conversations. I poured coffee for each of them and offered light commentary about the weather and neighborhood news, keeping the tone casual while letting my attention observe every glance, every hesitation, every subtle gesture. At one point, Daniel leaned forward slightly, attempting to engage me in discussion about investment planning, while Sarah asked about routine health checks with a tone too deliberate to be merely caring. Melissa chimed in with recommendations for home organization, her eyes flicking briefly toward a stack of documents I had intentionally left visible. I paused mid-sentence, letting a quiet smile settle on my face. It is interesting how concern can appear suddenly, I said softly, deliberately letting the words linger in the room. Each of them reacted immediately, slightly startled, unsure of what I meant, but too polite to inquire further. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of my presence and calm authority settle across the room. Then, slowly, I revealed small details about my intentions for the estate, carefully framed to assert clarity without confrontation. I noted every shift in posture, every quickened glance, every exchange of brief, loaded looks. It was a delicate dance, but one I had anticipated. Their sudden attentiveness had revealed patterns, and patterns reveal opportunity. By controlling what I disclosed and when, I guided their understanding without argument or force, letting the truth settle like a gentle tide that could not be resisted. Hours passed as the conversation continued, shifting seamlessly between casual commentary and subtle tests of comprehension, each participant attempting to gauge my position, my plans, and my composure. By the time they rose to leave, the sun had dipped low, spilling a golden glow across the room. I watched them gather their belongings, noting the tension that now tempered their smiles, the realization that I had remained fully aware and in control throughout. Once the door closed behind the last of them, I sat in the living room, sunlight fading and shadows lengthening, allowing myself a small, quiet smile. Weeks of careful observation, patience, and measured engagement had culminated in a balance of understanding and respect. I had navigated their curiosity and self-interest without conflict, asserting agency with grace and calm authority. I poured another cup of tea and looked out across the garden, appreciating the stillness of the evening and the knowledge that, in this house, the decisions, the pace, and the direction were firmly mine to guide. The family had finally understood, without need for confrontation, that their interest would no longer dictate my actions, and that respect and clarity had their own quiet power.